And it's sorry I didn't get to everybody, but it's great to be here this evening. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program this evening. Welcome to our thousands of loyal weekly viewers who hail, as you heard, from every state in the Union and from many other continents as well. In light of the intensity of the current events in Israel, tonight we are especially pleased to welcome the New York Times Jerusalem reporter and author Isabel Kershner, as well as Ambassador Martin Indyk. Isabel Kershner's recently released book, and here it is, Israel, the Land of Hope and Fear, the Battle for Israel's Inner Soul. You have the link to it in the emails you got before the program, and we'll put it in the chat tonight. The book is sure to enlighten us, as will its author, during these very worrisome times. Next week on July 19th, we welcome two of the country's most impressive, respected, and even entertaining political pundits, Democratic consultant Robert Shrum and Republican consultant Michael Murphy. They will be looking ahead to upcoming primaries and tell us where they think we are heading in 2024. Moderating will be the always wonderful Larry Mantle of NPR's local LA affiliate, LAist, formerly KPCC. On July 25th, we welcome the always interesting Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg. Prior to joining the New York Times in 2017, Michelle was a senior correspondent for the American Prospect, a columnist for the Daily Beast and Slate, and senior writer for The Nation magazine. She has written 3 books to great acclaim, one of which focused on the rise of Christian nationalism. Michelle will be in conversation with the always wonderful Warren Olney. Thanks again for being with us tonight. Now for a couple of additional announcements, my colleague and friend, David Lear. David?
Thank you, Janice. And I join her in welcoming you all to America at a Crossroads on behalf of community advocates. This is a special evening for us, a landmark. In our over 170 programs, this is our first guest who is coming to us live from Israel, 10 hours difference from the West Coast. Special kudos to Isabel Kershner, who is up and coherent at 3 a.m. Israel time. In 3 weeks, on August 2nd, we explore a different part of our lives with a discussion of what's happening in America's religions. We welcome Mark Oppenheimer, author, professor, and for years, the man behind the New York Times Beliefs column. On August 9th, we'll be back in the middle of current events with former ambassador to Moscow, Mike McFaul. Recall that he's the man that Putin wanted Trump to send back to Moscow for just interrogation by the Russian police. It didn't happen. Mike is a professor at Stanford, the head of the Freeman Spogli Institute there, and at the Hoover Institution. He'll discuss the Russia-Ukraine war and what the facts are in Moscow and Kyiv. He'll be interviewed by Stanford's democracy maven, Larry Diamond. It's now my pleasure to welcome former Congressman Mel Levine, who's a member of the Jews United Executive Committee. He's played a crucial role in the development of this series in many ways, not the least of which is by opening up his Rolodex to secure many of the outstanding guests we have hosted. Mel?
Thank you, David. Tonight's hour is especially special to me. The two people that we have this evening, I've known both of them for over 30 years. I've admired their work during the past 30 or more years. And having Isabel Kershner and Martin Indyk as our speakers this evening elevates our program. And we seldom do things with regard to the Middle East. Most of our focus is domestic, and I think it's wonderful that this particular Middle East program features Isabel and Martin. Isabel Kershner began reporting on Israel for the New York Times in 2007, having previously written for the Jerusalem Report and the New Republic. Her most recent book, which Janice referenced, is titled The Land of Hope and Fear, Israel's Battle for Its Inner Soul. That book has already received extremely warm praise. One commentator said that she tells Israel's story, quote, from every angle, every side, on every side, on an unbiased view, although she is a Zionist, end quote. So I again welcome Isabel here and commend the book to the people in our audience who I think will find it very interesting. Martin is someone I've known for 35 years. I remember vividly when Martin began his work with the Washington Institute in Washington, D.C. At that time, we actually worked quite closely on a number of Middle East-related issues, which continued throughout the 80s and 1990s for me. Martin subsequently, and actually initially at that time, became a fixture in U.S. Middle East policy. He served as our ambassador to Israel twice. Wonder about his sanity. He seems to have survived that very well. And after the 2 terms as ambassador, he was appointed by President Obama as the Middle East envoy for the resumption of peace talks during the Obama administration. He has written 4 books relating to the Middle East, and most recently, his book about Henry Kissinger, entitled Master of the Game, is a book that I couldn't put down and that I warmly recommend to our audience. I haven't mentioned to Martin that my wife had a book with the exact same title, Martin, but she's concluded that she doesn't intend to pursue that. On that note, I'm going to introduce Martin, who will interview Isabel, and I warmly welcome both of you here.
Thank you very much, Mel. It's a real pleasure to be on the small screen with you. Welcome to our viewers from all over America and all over the world, and a special thanks to Isabel, who is up at 3 a.m. in order for us to have this discussion. I thought the book was just wonderful, and I highly recommend it. You all should know that just last week, Isabel was awarded the Natan Notable Book Award for her book. That's the Jewish Book Club's award. And I think that the timing of the book could not have been better. For anybody who wants to really understand what is behind the events in Israel, the alarming events in Israel that are unfolding day to day, there's no better place to go than this book. So it couldn't be more timely. So Isabel, thank you for joining us. What we're looking at today from afar in Israel seems to be fairly chaotic, a effort that to overhaul the judiciary in a way that threatens Israel's democracy. Demonstrators in the streets for the 27th week, hundreds of thousands of them. Commentators talking about a train crash that's coming, a civil war that's going to break out. These are normally sober commentators, not alarmists. And at the same time as that, we've got the northern West Bank exploding and a sense of a third intifada on the way. So first question is, how did we get here? What does your book tell us about how Israel managed to get into this situation?
Well, first of all, hi, and thank you all. And yes, it is 3 a.m. here, but a pleasure to be with you all. How did we get here? I think, I found through my journey on working on this book that everything we are seeing today essentially has been brewing for a long time. And we're looking at demographic change in Israel, very challenging trends demographically, where the society is shifting more toward the religious, ultra-Orthodox element that is gaining more weight. And as you will probably know, the coalition government system here, which makes the Orthodox parties kingmakers in most governing coalitions, means that they often have disproportionate power. We're also seeing generational change and a change in what it means for many people here to be Jewish Israeli citizens of a Jewish state, and that is being redefined as we speak. So I think many of these things we're seeing today, the roots go back quite far, and the shifts in society are what are bringing us to this stage. So, in a way, it's kind of connected. We have the two fronts that you've identified, Martin. On the one hand, the internal strife going on in Israel right now. And on the other hand, we have the, slightly more outward situation of the Israeli-Palestinian unresolved conflict. But the two things are in a way connected, because if we're talking about that demographic change and that generational shift here, what we're seeing is a shift in Israeli society that's tilting more toward the religious nationalist elements of society, and a changing of the guard, if you will, new elites, and a kind of backlash against the old liberal Ashkenazi elites. And I think what we're seeing on both these fronts is the results today, where there's a toughening, much tougher position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and much less willingness to compromise. And of course, there are many, many reasons for that we can go into, including the weak, divided Palestinian leadership and the many, milestones along the way, like the Second Intifada, which basically decimated the Israeli peace camp. And at the same time, we have the internal push now to make Israel, more Jewish in the eyes of those nationalist and more religious Jews, and to therefore, weaken the Supreme Court, which in a way has been a bastion of the more liberal, secular society here.
What you also have, and we see it in the street demonstrations, is a push back from secular Israel. So tell us about them. Is this the last gasp of secular democratic Israel, or
Actually,
are they actually going to succeed?
It's not a last gasp. It's a remarkable pushback. It's a remarkable response. I think, even a year or 2 years ago, the liberal left in Israel was kind of in the doldrums and feeling very alienated and confused about the direction the country was taking. And then, this government comes in 6 months ago, including fringe elements from the far right, who would not have made it into the Knesset, into the parliament a few months before that. But because Netanyahu brought them together and made sure not a single right-wing vote would go to waste, not only got into parliament, but became key members of his coalition. And what we saw was a tremendous reaction from the liberal camp. And it's not only the left. This is soft right. There are some moderate religious people. There are Mizrahi, Oriental, Eastern Jews and Western Jews, Ashkenazim. It's not purely a left-right divide here, but it's the kind of moderate liberal camp, including some of the old liberal right, versus the rising ultra-nationalist camp. And yes, it's not a last gasp. I mean, I think we're seeing that liberal Israel is still alive and kicking, and not only alive and kicking, but it's the centers of power of the country who are out there on the streets. It's the high-tech entrepreneurs, it's the business leaders, it's the medical profession, it's academia, it's the military reservists, an absolute backbone of this protest movement, and the officers and commanders who are still in many cases volunteering for military reserve duty into their 50s. It's the people that the country really cannot do without.
One of the interesting things in your book that I found was the way in which you took community by community, or sector by sector, or actually tribe by tribe. And if you look at it that way, two tribes seem to be staying out of this conflict over Israel's democracy. the Haredim, and the Arabs. So tell us a little bit about where their interests lie, and if I'm right in saying they're staying out, why are they staying out of this fight?
Well, look, the Haredim are actually very much a part of this fight because within the government and within the coalition agreements that they got the Prime Minister to sign for their participation in the government, they're very staunchly behind this judicial overhaul for their own reasons, because the Supreme Court has ruled in some cases in the interests of, against religious coercion, and certainly on the one very important issue to the Haredi community, which is the mass exemptions that Haredi males get from obligatory military service here. And the Supreme Court has again and again struck down attempts to legislate these exemptions and anchor them in law on the grounds that this is against the principle of equality in Israeli society. So the Haredi parties, the politicians and the people who vote for them actually have a huge interest in this judicial overhaul going through for their own very particular interests. So they're staying out of the protests, both for and against. Obviously, they're not going to join the protests against the overhaul, but they haven't really come out for the protests in favor of the overhaul either, partly because they generally just keep to their own issues. They protest on their own agenda. They very rarely take part in sort of national issues like this, and also don't want to mingle in mixed crowds with men and women. So when you see the mass demonstrations in Bnei Brak or Jerusalem against army draft, for example, it's all men, okay? And they're not going to show up to a demonstration where they're going to be bumping up against a lot of settler women, for example. So you don't see them on the streets. When it comes to the Arab minority in Israel, we're talking about a fifth of the population.
What's the population of the ultra-Orthodox?
Oh, the ultra-Orthodox is probably somewhere around 12-13% of the overall population. However, that's a little deceptive because the population among the Haredi community, it's multiplying exponentially. The large families that are the norm in the ultra-Orthodox community, you're talking about 7 children plus, means that actually if you look at the age of the children below school age now, 1 in 4 children being born in Israel today are being born into Haredi families. And we are told that by 2050, if the current trends continue, that statistic will be double, that percentage will be double. And you're already looking at least 16% of 18-year-olds of army draft age who are Haredi. So if you look at the portion of the younger part of the population, it's much more than that 12% or 13%. And it's growing more significant as we go along. So in a way, yes, Israel is becoming more Haredi. And, in some respects, the Haredim are becoming more Israeli. We can talk about that too. But the Haredi issue is a massive one and a huge challenge as we look ahead in Israel. When it comes to the Palestinian Arab citizens, that's a fifth of the Israeli population. And here we're talking about within Israel proper. We're not talking about the West Bank, Gaza. They have long felt very alienated in general from the general Israeli government. There are Arab parties sitting in the Knesset for the vast majority of the time in the opposition. The last government, interestingly, was the first one, Naftali Bennett and Lapid's government was the first one that actually had the participation of a Islamist tiny party, Ram, of Mansour Abbas, which was sitting in the coalition, not as government members, not as ministers, but were part of the coalition. But most of the Palestinian Arab population, even though they have so much to lose by this judicial overhaul if it goes ahead, because the Supreme Court is really the last bastion for protecting minority rights in Israel against a very powerful government structure here. Despite that, they just feel kind of not part of what's going on. And for the most part, you don't see large participation of the Arab community. Another aspect is that the protest organizers, there's been a bit of a debate going on within the protest movement, but generally the protest organizers have preferred to separate out the issues here and keep the protest very much focused on anti-judicial overhaul and not try and mix it in with anti-occupation and Palestinian rights and other big issues on the agenda. And I think that has also kept away quite a large part of the Arab citizens of Israel.
So let's focus on where it goes from here. Are we headed for a civil war?
Well, look, President Herzog, of all people, has warned that, if anyone thinks that a civil war is impossible, they should think again. And we've been actually hearing warnings like this for 2 or 3 years now, even before the judicial overhaul came onto the agenda, just because of the depth of the divisions here and the strife, even before the judicial plan. Are people talking about taking up arms in the next few weeks? No. But if you look ahead, there's certainly a potential for violence. We've seen a prime minister of Israel be assassinated before. And we also, I think the way I see it is the main point for people being here is Hatikva, the hope, the Israeli national anthem, which is to be a free people in our country. If we get to a point where people feel that freedom is being taken away from them, if we are literally living in a dictatorship, which many legal scholars, experts, even Avichai Mandelblit, the last Attorney General, who was appointed by Prime Minister Netanyahu a few years ago, even he said on television last night that if this judicial overhaul goes ahead, we are on the verge of dictatorship. If people feel their freedom has been taken away, I do believe they will fight.
One of the interesting and disturbing, I should say, developments is the reservists from the Israeli army, and particularly the Israeli Air Force and volunteers, pilots, are saying they're not going to serve. Have you ever seen this before, and how serious do you think that is?
Never seen anything like this before, and I've been here over 30 years. The army has increasingly become a kind of battleground for the different sectors of society here. We've seen, despite the army's best efforts to keep politics out and to remain as the people's army, we're seeing its popular legitimacy being eroded all the time over the last few years, whether it's over religious issues of religious soldiers not wanting to serve with women, female soldiers, or whatever it is. But I think what we're seeing now in these months is unprecedented. And yes, it's pilots and hundreds of reservists from the most elite units, whether it's the offensive cyber units or the intelligence units, who are signing on letters saying, if this goes ahead, if we are indeed heading for a kind of dictatorship or tyranny of the majority here. That is not what we signed up for, and we will not continue to volunteer. These are people who are volunteering to continue as reservists. And what they are saying is they feel that the unwritten contract that they've always had between them and the state is being broken. The government is breaking the rules of the game. And to ask people to volunteer, to sacrifice themselves in this situation, we're seeing people saying, not going to happen. And I think this is one of the main pressure points on the government. We saw a few months ago when Netanyahu fired the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, because Gallant had the gall to come out and hold a press conference while the prime minister was in London and say this threat of people not coming to serve and not volunteering for reserve duty is such a threat to national security that this judicial overhaul has to be put on hold. And he got fired for that, and then the firing kind of got reversed. And 2 days later, Netanyahu himself decided to put the overhaul on pause and go into negotiations with the opposition parties, which failed. And we had a 3-month pause as a result, but that ended this week. And that's why we've seen everybody out back on the streets again yesterday.
You've watched Netanyahu for a long time now. He's been around for a long time. What's your sense of what he's thinking now? I mean, it looks like this train crash is coming. I can't imagine that he sees this as in his interests and as part of his legacy. Is he going to pull back at the last minute, or does he really think that he can win this confrontation?
It's rather mystifying, Martin. I'm not sure anybody knows what Netanyahu's intentions are right now, and I'm not sure Netanyahu knows. He's juggling and balancing between the demands of this coalition, which he needs to remain in power. Let's not forget he's on trial right now on corruption charges, and he wants to fight in court from the Prime Minister's office, and has therefore been clinging to power to the extent that, he took the country through 5 elections in just under 4 years, rather than step aside and let somebody else take over the Likud party while he sorts out his legal issues. But he's been very determined to stay in the chair. That means having these bedfellows that are the only ones that would sit with him in a government. And he's now having to maneuver between appeasing those coalition partners who are very staunchly demanding this judicial overhaul, and many in his own party. I mean, the Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, is from the Likud, and he's the brain behind all of this, and yet trying to avoid the kind of strife that we're talking about that could, end in a civil war. Now, what would he want this to be his legacy? I'm sure not. And he kept reassuring everybody at the beginning of this 6 months of this government that he would be the one with his hands on the wheel. He would be the one in charge of policy. Nobody had to worry about these fringe groups in the government. But we're actually seeing that he seems to be being led by the nose by them. He signed on frankly crazy coalition agreements with many of them, very far-reaching concessions, things that people just assumed wouldn't actually make it into law, but some of these things are making it into law. And now it seems like he might be trying to slow things down. He's now just advanced one piece of the judicial plan, the one that went through a first vote in Parliament this week and is now being prepared for a final vote. The government says before the summer recess at the end of this month. And, you know, nobody knows whether this is what people are calling the salami method, where this is just the first slice and the rest of it is going to be done in slices down the road to try and make it a bit more palatable, rather than the big legislative blitz that the Justice Minister had planned a few months ago. Or whether it will stop with this and, you know, this will be the one piece that goes through. He can then, you know, say to his coalition partners, okay, we've done some of it, you know, you've achieved part of your goal. Then the Parliament goes into recess until after the high holidays. And, you know, who knows by then, as the old Yiddish tale goes, the donkey may die, the king may die. You know, we don't know where we'll be by October. So at this point, honestly, I don't think anyone can tell you what his real intentions are. And I'm not sure he knows either.
Let's shift to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the same far-right parties and coalition members that are pushing the judicial reform are also pushing for what looks, to me at least, for de facto annexation of the West Bank. And that, of course, is stoking up tensions with the Palestinians, who are also engaged in their own militant activity, terrorist activity, and we've got the Israeli army responding to that. So we seem to have a real brewing confrontation on that front as well. We were actually witnessed it in Jenin last week. So what's your take on where that's going?
Well, it feels to me like the Israeli government of the day is almost reverse engineering Oslo Accords. I mean, we seem to be going backwards. Rather than, you know, keeping open the option of a two-state solution, which is what the American administrations have always begged Israel to do, you know, okay, it might not be realistic to reach an agreement right now, but please, let's leave the option open. But instead, what we're seeing is a reversal. We're seeing more and more settlement construction. We're seeing the retroactive authorization of settlement outposts, some of which are now like 20 or 30 years old, which were constructed originally without the Israeli government's permission. We're seeing, for example, the Jenin area that we saw the big major operation in was it just last week? We're seeing a total reversal there, where in 2005, as part of the disengagement plan of Ariel Sharon, when he unilaterally took Israel out of Gaza and unilaterally withdrew all the forces and settlers from the Gaza Strip, as a gesture to give some kind of political horizon on the West Bank, he also agreed to take down 4 settlements in the northern West Bank around Jenin, and to kind of allow that area to become a sort of pilot project, a model for a potential Palestinian entity or, you know, proto-state. And for a while, Jenin was flourishing, and there were no Israeli soldiers around and no friction, because there were no settlers there that needed protecting. But what we're seeing now is, first of all, a complete breakdown. Jenin itself and the refugee camp of Jenin have almost become like a kind of mini Gaza, where the militant factions, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and young, unaffiliated armed gunmen have really taken over the streets there. and have been using it as a base for attacks against Israelis, both in the West Bank and in Israel proper. And then you see the Israeli government actually passing a law or an amendment to the disengagement law a few weeks ago to allow settlers to actually go back to the area. So everything seems to actually be going backwards, and potentially this is as catastrophic, or if not more, for where Israel is heading, because there doesn't seem to be any vision. There doesn't seem to be any plan of how this is supposed to pan out. The only people that have a real vision and a plan are the far right. They know what they want. They do want to annex the whole area. They hope that many of the Palestinians will be so miserable they'll just somehow leave, and Israel will be in control of Judea and Samaria, as they call the occupied West Bank by its biblical names. And nobody else seems to have a plan right now. So yes, it's a huge concern looking ahead.
Netanyahu has a plan for peace with Saudi Arabia. How is all of this going to impact on the potential for first of all, the strengthening and expanding of the Abraham Accords, and secondly, for an Israeli-Saudi peace deal?
So yes, Netanyahu would love to have a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia. And we hear that, the Saudi Arabian leadership is much more amenable, and has also reversed its position, because if we go back to 2002 and the Saudi initiative, the doctrine was, we will normalize relations with Israel, as will the whole Arab and Muslim world, as soon as the Israelis have come to terms with the Palestinians. But now we're seeing a reversal of that. We've already seen with the Abraham Accords that Israel is able to forge diplomatic relations with former enemy states in the outer circle, and without having made any major concessions on the Palestinian front. It's what Netanyahu calls the outside-in doctrine. If you make peace with all the outside countries, it might in the end create an environment and a situation where the Palestinians then realize they've got nothing to hold out for and come to terms that are acceptable to Israel, and we all call it a day. At this point in time, it doesn't seem like the Saudis are demanding anything major in terms of concessions toward the Palestinians. They would probably need something, a resumption of talks or something, but it seems like more than they want a Palestinian state, it seems like they want things from the United States and to get what they want in terms of security from the and weapons and security arrangements from the United States, the path goes through Jerusalem. So yeah, we're seeing a complete reversal all over the region. Now, of course, it's a good thing for Israel to have relations with Arab countries. Israelis are having a wonderful time going for holidays to Dubai, and it's the big hit. We don't see so many Emiratis coming here for holidays at this point, but it's obviously a positive thing. And if it's expanded, so be it, that's great. Will it solve Israel's internal problem with the Palestinians in terms of, can Israel remain a Jewish democratic state as it defines itself and continue to occupy millions of Palestinians in the West Bank forever? At this point, relations with Saudi doesn't solve that problem.
No. And what we actually see is the Saudis and the Abraham Accord countries, starting with Morocco backing away. And just recently, the Saudi price in terms of what they need on the Palestinian front is going up because of the conflict that's going on.
Discomfort. And also we saw Morocco putting off, there was supposed to be a Negev summit, a meeting of the Israelis and Arab allies in Morocco at the end of this month, and Morocco has put that off for the same reason. It's just too uncomfortable timing right now.
One of the things that doesn't get a lot of attention, but I wonder whether you've been looking at it, is the way that Iran seems to be trying to probe what I believe they see as weakness in Israel now, especially with reservists talking about not serving and so on. So we see Hezbollah seeming to be probing and creating some tensions on the border there. We see Iran supporting Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Jenin and Nablus, as well as in Gaza. And of course, the Iranian nuclear program is advancing as we speak towards a nuclear threshold. So that used to be Bibi Netanyahu's major concern. And yet he seems to be totally distracted from that threat. How do you see that dimension of the conflict?
Well, I think the security establishment here has certainly not lost sight of that. And that is why they are so concerned with the pilots, the reservists revolt, etc. Because if in the end
Let's just focus on that for a moment. The pilots are the pilots that have to deal with Iran, or potentially Iran's nuclear program. And they're the ones that are talking about not serving.
The pilots, Israel's Air Force is very dependent on reservists. It takes a long time to train. You can only train so many. You have so many aircraft. And the reservists are a very important part of any major operation across enemy borders. Netanyahu, I don't think he's totally lost sight of it, but I think he's just putting out fires at home. I think he has lost a lot of his, if he had leverage on the Iran front, he's lost it. The move to get President Trump to cancel the JCPOA agreement, many people here said was a disaster. Because nothing came to replace it. All you had was Iran rushing ahead with enrichment and being closer than ever to being a nuclear threshold state, if it isn't one right now. So yes, it's been a big failure, and maybe that's why he's kind of gone a bit quiet. But Israelis are very aware of Hezbollah on the borders. There's tension right now on the northern border with Lebanon, with the Iranian-backed Hezbollah creating provocations along the border. There's an expectation always of another war with Hezbollah. And what we're hearing is the defense minister, who is still in his post, Gallant, and President Herzog and many other people saying, don't test us. We might look weak right now, and we might look divided, and you might think this is a good time to provoke Israel or drag Israel into a conflict, but don't test us and don't be fooled, because really we're very united. Well, we'd have to see if that was the case. Although I do tend to believe that if it came to the crunch, the pilots would show up, because they are patriots first and foremost, and this is the only country they have.
Yeah, and the external conflict could well unite the tribes, as done before. But on the other hand, Netanyahu is pretty cautious about going to war. He hasn't started a war or gone to war, and I suspect he knows well the history of prime ministers that have taken Israel to war. they didn't last very long afterwards. I've been feeding in questions from the audience, Isabel, and there's one here that I too would like to know the answer to is, how is Israel's economic miracle surviving this political mess?
Well, it's surviving for now just because Israel began from a very strong economic position. The high-tech industry, which is really the backbone or the driver of the Israeli economy, is still, we have more unicorn companies here per capita than I think any other country in the world. And that doesn't all just dissipate in 6 months. But people are beginning to feel the pinch. They're as well as the global problems with the industry. There are slowdowns in investment from abroad. The governor of the central bank, the Bank of Israel, said just this week that the uncertainty and instability surrounding this judicial overhaul plan is going to cost. It is going to come at cost for Israelis. And yes, I mean, there's some capital that has been taken out of the country. We've had some of the high-tech entrepreneurs saying we're taking our money out because we don't trust this government. And if there aren't independent courts here, we don't want our money here. We're not seeing a massive flight of capital, but there has been some. But, it's such a robust high-tech industry that, and these people are first and foremost Israelis. And what we're seeing is they're taking part in the protest. They're very much funding the protest movement, and they're out on the streets, and they're telling their employees, if you want to take the day off tomorrow to go to the protest, that's fine. Some of them are laying on buses to get their employees to the protest. But so far, the general economy is holding up.
There is another tribe that has an interest in Israel, and that's the American Jewish community. And I just wonder what your take is on the state of relations between the United States and Israel, between Biden and Netanyahu, and between American Jews and Israel.
Well, I think clearly we're seeing open tension between the Biden administration and this government. We've seen President Biden calling this the most extreme government, even though he himself defines himself as a Zionist, and says he's dealt with Israeli government since Golda Meir. We've seen President Biden also in a probably off-script moment saying, invite Netanyahu to the White House? No, not anytime soon. And we're going to have Herzog instead, the president. So it's out in the open. Now, what Netanyahu would say is, it's the relationship is strong. The strategic relationship is absolutely set. Ironclad, I think, is the word that the diplomats use. You would know better. But at the personal level of this government and the administration, it's bad. I think when it comes to the American Jewish community, it's a real challenge for mostly progressive, liberal, democratic American Jews to identify with an Israeli government like this. And this Israeli government, I don't think, cares very much about what the majority of American Jews think. Many of the parties in this government, as I said, are very parochial, focused on their own sectoral interests within Israel. Even within Israeli terms, they're extremely parochial. So I think we're in a very bad period, but that's just the government, and it does not represent all Israelis. And there are many other Israelis and many other Israeli politicians on the other side of the lines who very much care about this relationship, both the bipartisan relationship with the American administrations, which has always been such a strategic asset for Israel, but also with the American Jewish community. And, you know, I think we're maybe in a phase right now, which might not necessarily last forever. But, you know, I think there is damage on the other side. I think, you know, you would know better at your end, but we are seeing more and more, especially young American Jews who are just unable to identify with this country right now. And whether that is reversible or not, it's an open question.
What are the prospects for Netanyahu's coalition survival, given all these tensions? And if the government were to come apart, what would likely happen?
Well, you know, it's always a bad idea to try and predict anything in Israeli politics, but I would say this coalition will last as long as Netanyahu wants it to. For most of the parties, there's nowhere better to go. The far-right parties are not ever going to have it better than this. The ultra-Orthodox parties have, you know, although there used to be swing parties that could go with left-wing governments as well, they've become increasingly shifted toward the right in recent years and have a kind of a loyalty, you know, contract with Netanyahu, certainly the Shas party. And, you know, I think that until Netanyahu feels that it's time to break it up, we might see it last, you know, months, a year, 2 years, I wouldn't like to say. Few Israeli governments last their full term. So I'm not sure why this one would be an exception and last beyond 2 or 3 years. But, you know, there are other possibilities as well. I mean, a lot of the situation we're in is because of Netanyahu's trial. If this trial ever comes to an end, and if Netanyahu is either convicted or acquitted, then we're in a new political situation. Same if there is some kind of national security emergency. If Israel really was on the brink of war, you might then see the centrist parties, Benny Gantz, coming in to save the day and to form a unity government, even though they had pledged not to sit with the prime minister so long as he's on trial. And that would again marginalize the fringe parties. So there are many variables here and it's hard to predict, but it's not going to last forever.
But will Israel survive until then? So you know, we're coming to the end of our time here, Isabel, and I don't want the audience to feel like it's time for them to go out and slit their wrists after listening to us having this conversation. So give us some hope here, not false hopes, but what's the silver lining? Is there a silver lining in this terrible situation?
I think there is. I think there is, Martin. I have to say, working on this book, which was essentially for me a journey into every nook and cranny of Israeli society, I came away blown away. You know, every person here has a story. Everybody here wants to be here. This is their home, whether they're Jews or Arabs, left or right, religious, secular, liberals, zealots. They all want to be here. And they're not going anywhere. And I think that the passion and the engagement that you see at all levels of society here is remarkable. It's something rare, and it's an asset for any country. And Israel it's, you know, 75 years old. It's still a work in progress in many ways. But I think, when you see the protesters in the streets from both sides of the divide, both for and against this judicial overhaul, which is a fight over the soul of Israel. It's about the future of the country's character as a democracy. It really is an extremely fundamental battle going on here. But you see both sides coming out into the streets, waving the Israeli flag. And, a Polish journalist told me recently that when the Polish anti-government, pro-democracy protesters were coming out, they were embarrassed to carry the Polish flag. They carried a EU flag, a European Union flag. Here, people are wrapping themselves in the flag. The pro-democracy, anti-judicial reform people are holding on to the Declaration of Independence from 1948. People are passionately engaged and attached to this country. And I came away inspired. And, despite the problems and the challenges and the feeling that we're driving towards a precipice, all of which is true, the quality of the people here is really the country's treasure.
So 25 years from now, are we going to see a Jewish and democratic state at peace with its Palestinian neighbors? Or is it going to be
that would be the hope. That would be the hope.
A Jewish-dominated state that is no longer democratic?
That could be the reality. We're in the midst of the battle right now.
And it is a gripping battle for those of us who are watching from afar and worrying about the future of Israel. It is a very disturbing trend line that we're seeing. But we rely on Isabel Kershner, both from her book and from her reporting, which you can read in the New York Times, to understand what is going on. And so, Isabel, we're very grateful to you for writing this book. I hope everybody will go out now and get their copies, because it really is the best place to go to understand what is happening today. And of course, we'll be reading you in the New York Times. So thank you, Isabel.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of this session. I've been asked to remind you that the Town Hall America at a Crossroads continues. And the next session will be on Wednesday, July 19th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, when Bob Schramm and Mike Murphy are going to be talking about American politics. These are two renowned political pundits. You couldn't get better political analysis from Shrummy and Murphy. They've been involved in presidential campaigns for decades now. So I hope you won't miss that. Thank you all for listening in, and thank you, Isabel, again for a wonderful exposition.
Thank you.
Have a good night.